Welcome to the World United. Welcome to the World United.
Hello, my name is Craig Hassard, and I'm here to present something on mindfulness and mind-body medicine, with a particular emphasis on their role in education. So it's good to be with you all today, and great to be a part of this conference, and I hope it reaches a lot of people and creates a lot of interest. So I better get underway because we don't have a lot of time. So when we're born, when we're young, being in the present moment, paying attention, being curious and engaged in the world is a very natural state. We weren't born distracted and worrying, but that's pretty much a habit we get into early in life. But these days we're increasingly living in a more distracted world. This is just a Microsoft report noting the average human being has apparently a shorter attention span than a goldfish. And every time they've measured it over recent decades, attention spans have been dropping. And as the CEO of Microsoft said, the true scarce commodity is increasingly human attention. And of course, these days, and especially in developed, affluent countries and time pressures and so on, we're creating more and more burden and distraction all the time. And so many people feel overloaded much of the time. We get lost and buried in a mountain of work. This is a Harvard Business Review paper that describes the modern work environment as hyperkinetic. So that means time pressured, under the pump, fast-paced. And that kind of world is associated with what they called attention deficit trait, the tendency to have a shorter attention span and find it harder and harder to focus. An attention deficit trait was associated with things like black and white thinking, difficulty staying organized, setting priorities and managing time, and a constant low level of panic and guilt. It's pretty much the modern world these days. And then we develop strategies that we think are going to help, but they become the next part of the problem. And of course, one of them these days is growing up thinking that we both can and should complex multitask. That is, be doing multiple things at the same time. And of course, we can't do that. The attention, the human brain does not pay attention to two or more complex things at the same time. So, and this is Clifford Nass from Stanford, just describing what's going on for kids these days. These are kids who are doing 5, 6 or more things at once all the time. It turns out multitaskers are terrible at every aspect of multitasking. They get distracted constantly. Their memory is very disorganized. Recent work we've done suggests they're worse at analytical reasoning. We worry that it may be. We're creating people who may not be able to think well and clearly. And of course, this is our modern idea of being connected. This is what being connected looks like these days. And of course, on one level, we're connected. And mind you, the technology is doing a great job, especially in the COVID world when so much of the time people can't physically meet. So to some extent, the technology can be great for increasing connection. But there's also something else happening which is actually far more subtle and pervasive. And that's a kind of disconnect. As you can see, a disconnect from environment, a disconnect from each other. People aren't engaging in the same way with each other, and a disconnect from oneself. And so if you look at, say, social media, the amount of texting inversely related to fulfillment within intimate relationships. So people spend more time texting each other than actually meaningfully communicating with each other. Having a phone or computer by the bed, checking emails or sending text messages in the night interferes with sleep and increases the risk of mental health problems. A lot of children have got their computers, their iPads and so on in the bedroom, spending way too much time on their screens. Over 25% of young people have a diagnosable addiction to their mobile devices, and not using the term figuratively, literally an addiction, that they can't control the behavior. Facebook addiction disorder. So the more that people use, say, social media like Facebook, the more narcissistic they become and the poorer their mental health. This was a study of young adults, and finding that those who use social media the most had about triple the rate of depression compared to those who use it the least. So our way of connecting is actually creating a kind of disconnect. So this was a study in Australia that was just looking at finding that 60% of people responded, said they often felt lonely, and 82.5% felt loneliness was increasing in society. We're actually becoming more and more lonely when we're relying on social media as a way of connecting at the expense of meaningful and real connection with each other. So we're becoming disconnected, we're becoming distracted. Now, when we're not mindful, when we're not present, when we're not engaged in the present moment, then the brain slips into a different mode called default mode. So if, for example, you're reading a book and you're not taking in what you're reading because your mind's thinking about what you're going to cook for dinner, then you're in default mode. If somebody's speaking to you and you realize all of a sudden that you're not hearing what they're saying because your mind is thinking about some work you've got to do later in the day, then you're in default mode. So default mode is the distracted, inattentive and disengaged state of mind. So we're worrying, ruminating, catastrophizing, etc. They're all forms of default mode. So there's a lot of default mental activity in states like stress and anxiety and depression. It's associated with poor mental health. So the mind's idle, flapping in the wind, not connected, not aware, not making conscious decisions, just living life on automatic pilot. And when we're doing that, of course, we just respond in the way that we're conditioned to respond. And of course, this default mental activity, this mind ruminating and worrying, is when actually looking at the content of it, is all about the multifaceted self, as it's sometimes described. I suppose you could say it's the ego. We're constantly thinking about ourselves. So to be mindful means to stop thinking about ourselves and very much to engage in the present moment, to reconnect with where we are, ourselves, our environment, our interaction between the two. And of course, these days, the ego rules so much of the time. There's the me generation. So we're constantly obsessed and distracted by social media, self-obsession, taking selfies all the time. For many, many people, a more fragile sense of self-esteem, constantly looking for approval, constant social comparison with others. And more virtual rather than real relationships. So virtual relationships are replacing real relationships, real communication. So, and fear of missing out, and of course, online bullying. There are lots of different aspects, problematic aspects to all of this. So there are problems that we need to deal with. One, perhaps other one that's important, this is a massive amount of data globally looking at developed countries and what are expected to be the 10 top burdens of disease by the year 2030. And as you can see, depression's expected to be way out in front. And then you've got heart disease, dementia, alcohol abuse, diabetes. It's all lifestyle and mental health related. So in this distracted, disconnected world, we shouldn't be surprised that there's a lot of interest in mindfulness. And so you can see there that the mindful revolution, as it's described, but it's being mindful is certainly not a new idea. Paying attention, meditating, being present. But here is a quote from the first major textbook in psychology written in 1890 by William James. The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui, or a master of themselves. So no one's a master of themselves if you have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. So there it was at the birth of psychology, but the skills in how to train attention weren't widely known about or used. So it's a footnote and ignored for about another century. This is just a graph showing you the number of studies on mindfulness published in peer-reviewed scientific journals over the last few decades. As you can see, there's been a rapid growth. In 2020, by the end of this year, there'll probably be at least another 2,000 studies published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. So there's this exponential growth in research on mindfulness. Now, in terms of why there's such a lot of interest, well, stress is certainly one of the reasons. And I don't have time to go into the details of the fight or flight response if you're in a situation like this. But the stress response in certain circumstances like this might be, if we're lucky, the difference between life and death. So fight the shark and then fly. If we're lucky, we'll get out of danger, like Mick Fanning, the famous Australian surfer, did in this situation. But unfortunately, we often activate the response at times when we don't really need it. So man's not disturbed by events, but by the view he takes of them. Epictetus was an ancient Greek. Events in themselves, I mean, it's one thing when we're facing a shark. I mean, that is a real stressor. But in other situations, worrying about, getting through the traffic, getting home by a certain time, a deadline at work, we, in the way that we perceive things, create stressors out of thin air. And so we're often generating stressors when they don't need to be and activating the fight or flight response in the same way that we need for a shark, but in situations that don't require it. Getting a red light and getting angry and reactive. Now, the ancient Greeks, Plato, for example, being paraphrased by the Renaissance philosopher Marsilio Ficino, the body is the shadow of the soul, and soul's a translation of the word psyche. What goes on in our psyche, that is the mind, will have effects on the body. And of course, you don't get a shadow without a source of light. And the source of light is the attention, it's the consciousness. So what we give our consciousness to in the mind will produce an effect, if you like, in the body, which is the shadow. So consciousness, mind, and body. And so this metaphysical relationship you find at the core of all of the world's great wisdom traditions, from the Greeks to the East and so on. So this is a very ancient notion. So allostatic load is a term given to the physiological wear and tear we put on our body of overactivating the stress response day after day when we don't actually need it. So the wear and tear we put on our body, it impairs our immunity, it accelerates the hardening of the arteries, damages the bones, damages the brain. So we lose brain cells at a rapid rate, especially in the executive functioning and memory circuits of the brain, the areas of the brain we rely on for learning and high performance, etc. And there's only one bit of the brain that grows, and that's the amygdala. That's the brain's stress center. So if it's being activated all the time, it gets bigger and it gets more reactive. We literally wire the brain for more stress. Anger and cardiac disease, looking at how often a person gets angry. So people who don't tend to get angry much, about once a month, average about twice a day, get angry a lot, 5 times a day. And they're looking at whether a person's got high, medium, or low cardiac risk factors like smoking or being sedentary or being overweight, having diabetes, etc. So as you can see, if a person gets angry, the more they get angry, the bigger the increase in the number of excess cases of coronary heart disease. So for those who've got cardiac risk factors and get angry a lot, 657 extra cases of coronary heart disease per 10,000 people per year. That's a lot. So anger, this activation of the fight or flight response, whether or not we damage somebody else with our anger, we certainly are harming ourselves. Telomeres, I won't say too much about this, but they're the little caps on the end of our chromosomes that stop our DNA from unraveling. But they're the marker of our biological age. The shorter the telomeres, essentially, the older we are and the bigger the risk of the illnesses that are associated with aging. So mind wandering and aging. So they're looking at telomere length, but the more a person's mind tends to wander, the shorter the telomeres are. That is, the faster that person is aging. So short telomeres, not a good thing. And this research was looked at by, or done by Elizabeth Blackburn, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2009 for discovering telomeres. She's an Australian scientist working in the United States. Hostility and telomere length, especially for men. Men with high levels of anger and hostility are aging very fast down to the DNA of the cells. People do not have a long life expectancy when they tend to get angry a lot. Anger harms ourselves, and of course, it often harms others as well. So mindfulness, so practicing some meditation, learning to come out of this present moment of worry and rumination, out of this sort of default mode of worry and rumination, back into the present moment, learning to just ride those emotional reactions, etc. So this is the first of a series of studies showing that mindfulness slowed down the aging process right down to the DNA of the cells. It also changes the brain. Neurons that fire together, wire together. When we practice getting angry, the brain wires itself for anger. When we practice being more mindful and being able to manage our emotions better, the brain wires itself for that. So mindfulness in the brain, it changes the way the brain is not only functioning, but how it's structured. It stimulates new brain cell growth in those areas of the brain that get damaged by default mode and by allostatic load and so on. But it also quietens down the amygdala, the stress center that also fires off when we get very angry and so on. So it quietens down the stress areas of the brain, but it stimulates the areas of the brain that we rely on for being able to make decisions, to learn, to manage our emotions better, etc. This is from Harvard University, and just finding that practices that bring about the relaxation response, like meditation, actually switch down the stress response at the level of the genes, at the levels of the DNA of the cells. It quietens down the level to which those stress genes are actually expressing themselves. So that's an epigenetic effect. So meditation fosters self-mastery. So there's a number of ways in which meditation and learning meditation as a life skill for a child or as an adult, an essential life skill that we have to learn in life. So it helps to foster greater self-awareness, to be aware of ourselves, our mind, our thoughts, our reactions, emotional regulation, our ability to manage those emotions, manage our appetites, of course, which are healthy to a point, but when excessive, lead to addictions and so on. Our ability to make decisions with more wisdom, to be creative and mentally flexible, to be able to solve problems, to cultivate compassion, for more meaningful communication. So there's research on all of these areas about how meditation is the essential life skill that underpins so many other things that are important in life. That's why I think it should be a part of education right from earliest days in school and right through into university. And we never stop really learning. And for many people, mindfulness has become a kind of a secular spirituality. But of all of the world's great wisdom traditions have fostered wisdom, our ability to manage our appetites and emotions better, to cultivate compassion. So these are actually core skills that all of the world's great wisdom traditions foster as well. And of course, and beyond, ultimately, meditation is about transcending our small selves, if you like, and worldly life, to transcend that, liberation and enlightenment. That's what it's perhaps ultimately about. So anyway, just wanted to go from the little picture perhaps through to the big picture. So that's all from me. So thank you very much for listening, and I think we've got a panel discussion later on. Thank you very much.
So Pranam, Dr. Craig Hassad, thank you so much